Why is it so important for a company like Epic Games to engage in the film and storytelling markets where traditionally it was video games only?
Well, I think the answer really sort of lies in that at the heart of a lot of games is still a story. And there's also an opportunity for, it's not quite right to maybe say new art forms, but there are new entertainment and storytelling opportunities that we don't even know about yet, that can come about from merging technologies and groups of people together. So for us, it's the interest in providing technology, democratizing the process, and seeing what comes out of putting filmmakers and games programmers and games artists and visual effects artists and CG animation artists, what happens when you put them into a big melting pot and just give them the opportunity to try something new? And also just what kind of filmmaker is going to come out of that ability to have the access to the technology when it's free, when there's a low barrier to entry for learning, and the response time is instantaneous because it's a real-time engine. You're not waiting for hours to see the end product of your work. You can have those, sort of magic moments of having that sort of accidental, creative sort of avenue that you've then gone down and realized that's magic. And you push and you pull on that thread and you see where you go. So that's really why we're after it.
Thank you very much. And now I'm going to throw to Kinga, because Kinga's got a very interesting background. It doesn't come from a games industry background. It doesn't particularly come from a filmmaking background, but it comes from a background of where we're seated here today. She comes from a theatre background. And how the technology, how you came to be where you are today and embrace the technology and be one of those to really be able to share and pass on that knowledge to the next generation of filmmakers and storytellers.
Epic's always really been, as far as my experience goes, always been really keen on embracing people who are just keen on learning the technology. And in all fairness, when I started with Epic, being now 3 years ago, I didn't really touch on Unreal Engine. I heard of it, of course, Fortnite and all. But in terms of what the underlying engine capabilities are, I myself haven't heard of it. So I just started as, many people do start, runner, studio systems, etc. And it was during the pandemic, as many things go, that we had the chance to actually build a small R&D stage within our own space in London. And it was just a whole, steep learning curve for me in terms of just being chucked into this new world. The actual commercialization of the virtual production techniques just started emerging, so I could really be at the root of and learn really the underlying basic principles of it and see how those tools that used to take quite a bit to actually master have become, in the past year and a half, even just the past couple of months with new Unreal Engine releases, have become so much more accessible. And indeed, the barrier of entry has lowered just so dramatically that you can see how many people are actually engaging. And the more conversations we have nowadays, more people come to us and say, actually, I've already done this and this and this in Unreal Engine versus what was the conversation around like a year, 2 years ago, saying like, oh, okay, so where do I even go to download it? So with us talking to people and I guess listening to what makes it accessible, I do believe that there's been such a dramatic change to the positive that a lot of people are now actually looking into prevising in Unreal Engine. And the good bit about this is, as Jordan said, it's completely iterative. And if you have a level, you mess around because it's game engine, so you're always going to look through a camera. There you go. So once you can sequence a couple of shots, and within the same project, if you ever so inclined and continue working on it and end up on one of the virtual production stages, such as the one at ARRI, you can actually do the whole production process within the same engine, and it's just fascinating. And I've seen quite a few of these projects and worked on quite a few of these projects, and you can see the levels. Again, it's game engine terminology, but you can see the levels where people just started messing around, and then you can see the end result, and it's really amazing. And yeah, that was sort of my journey through it as well, just being chucked into it, but and immersed in it, and yeah, it's been.
David, I was going to say, if you don't mind as well, with your experience, because you've learned it
Yeah.
for the last 3 years in real life, one of the challenges for us today is to try and demystify how it works, because it's not necessarily understood fully, and it's quite difficult to explain sometimes in parts. So to the point Stephen made when he introduced us, please, once we move through this, feel free to stick your hand up and say, slow down guys, we don't understand if you're talking about a component of the workflow, because it is new and it's moved so fast that it's not always easy to completely understand. So please do put your hand up seriously if anyone's got a question. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, maybe I can give everybody, like, if you haven't had any experience with 3D graphics, it's really simple. There's the concept of you're building a little model inside, programs, you add them together in the engine. The idea of how you paint a set, how you make choices about art direction, all those skills and those techniques have analogs inside the engine. The use of, as Kinga said, there's cameras. So you can apply lenses and film back choices, and you can see things the way you would through your intended equipment. There are lights, so you can apply cinematography processes to it. There are abilities to then take physical input, so you can take an iPad and move it around. So all these things, there's a lot of, there are technical steps, but the processes that you use as filmmakers are available to you in the engine.
And Rob, as a traditional filmmaker, how come you were so interested in the technology? What were the opportunities it gave you as a traditional filmmaker coming into this space?
I think first and foremost, I was nervous of the technology. Everyone was telling me how restrictive it was. I thought it was going to restrict me as a filmmaker. There was a lot of information coming out of post-production houses that you couldn't do certain things. You had to worry about moire, you had to worry about dark screens. You couldn't shoot off axis. There were a lot of ways I thought, hang on, this is going to restrict me as a filmmaker. When I went into the volume, I immediately had this sort of little nirvana moment. Hang on, I'm now in a space that gives me creative control over my environment. But also allows me to increase that creativity. Now, a classic example of that would be if I was doing a sunset scene somewhere and I'm looking at my watch because the light's going and I know I've got reverses to shoot, so maybe I'm going to compromise on a performance and compromise on a take because I know I've only got 40 minutes to get the reverses and to come around on that. Within a volume, because my background is totally controlled, whether that's shot as a plate or whether it's generated by 3D, within a volume, I can put the sun exactly where I want it and it will stay there. So I can then concentrate on performance and go for that extra take and film that extra take. And, you don't have the other elements of weather. You don't have situations where you've got a lot of wind noise. You're just working within a controlled environment. Traditionally, producers and cinematographers, there's a bit of a wrangle that goes on between technology, creativity and cost. And this is sort of the first piece of technology that I'd encountered where everybody's happy. Because basically the producer has assurances that this is going to happen in this amount of time, and the cinematographer says, I can really play God now. As cinematographers, we've all got egos. So the fact that we can sit there and play God and say, I want to put the sun there, and I want to put the sun there, or I want to take that tree out of shot because that's growing out the back of his head. If you've got digital assets, you can manipulate them. And the other key component, which moves me away from green screen or rear projection, is the fact that the lighting is wraparound. So the scene lighting is actually lighting the face. So rather than me having to use a lot of additional lights, I will always use RGBW, I will always use film sources to light the foreground. But I'm actually getting very immersive lighting, which is great if you've got a reflective surface, if you've got a car, if you've got something like this. So yeah, the joke is I went to ARRI to just have a conversation with them about what a studio might look like and how as a filmmaker I might use it. And I think I went for 2 days, and 3 years later, I'm kind of still there and just loving shooting on it. So yeah, I mean, it's a great environment for filmmakers. We'll talk about budget savings and things like that later, but yeah, it's a great place to play, basically, as a creative.
So Piers, as a producer and studio owner, why would you consider virtual production above more traditional technologies? What is it about the technology which makes you go, okay, I'm going to make an investment here. I'm going to take a bit of risk because if you don't understand and if you don't know the technology, it's a risk. But for someone like yourself, Piers, what was it that was the convincing moment?
Well, I wasn't convinced immediately, but to the point you've just made, Rob, now I completely am, and I have been for over a year. And I think that, it's future-proofed, and I think the workflows that we'll probably touch on in a little bit as well are becoming more and more streamlined and less clunky than perhaps in 2020 or 2021. And so, as someone looking at this sector, you kind of compare what is everybody doing, and then you look at this technology and this area that we're in, and it feels to me like it's future-proofed. And it's going to talk and respond to a number of issues in the industry and also around the world. So that's why, for us, we feel so passionate about looking at enhancing this and investing further into these sorts of studios.
And Jordan, if there was a young filmmaker who was to come up to you today and said, look, I know nothing, but I want to give it a shot. I want to use Unreal Engine to start my process of telling the story I have had in mind for years, but it's too expensive to do. How is the new technology in the game engine going to solve my issues and allow me to tell that story?
Small question. No, all right. So I think we can split this up a bit. So the idea, the technology that we have, consider it being able to do like a digital workshop of your project, right? So if you want to start at the beginning, you're just even working through your script. You have the opportunity to start staging it, see what's in your mind's eye practically in front of you on a computer screen, alter your plans, respond to it, change your scripting, work through what might actually be too expensive to shoot, figure out if there's alternate ways to go about it. So that's on the pre-production side. So you can do this by yourself with a glass of wine in the evening. You don't need any assistance once you've kind of got the base knowledge, right? This is not about making a final frame. So if your character happens to just kind of float through frame and twists and turns, but it gives you, the pacing, and you can do the voiceovers and things like that. That's freedom to explore. On the flip side, there's also the medium side of which is you might be able to go as sort of indie, sort of scrappy as finding like a mate that has a really big TV and putting content up on the TV from Unreal Engine or even plates that you shot for doing close-ups. Then it gets into the larger sort of other pop-up walls or working with groups like ARRI on their stage. So you have a whole range of solutions that cover you from what is my story, how am I trying to tell it, through to the final execution. And these are just, this is going to keep evolving. And the workflows will become easier because we are trying to take it from a position of, as a technology that was used to make games, which is a very technical process, full of creativity, but a very technical process. We're looking at it from the point of view of how would a filmmaker approach these tools, and how do we meet people where they are, rather than forcing them to learn game engine technology.
That's pretty good. And Rob, as a director, I mean, you looking at scripts, what are you looking out for when you're going, okay, this is for virtual production, this is not for virtual production? What are those key things?
This is really interesting within the context of independent filmmaking, because very often there can be very ambitious scripts that don't necessarily fit with the budget. But up until now, people have been using virtual production to shoot scripts that probably were written way before virtual production came out, and they're adapting them for virtual production. The opportunity that exists now is for people to write scripts that work for virtual production. And I'll give you an example. There's a showrunner who I was working with, and she was getting the scripts through, and she was reading through the scripts, and she said traditionally she'd see a scene which would say, set on the top of the Himalayas, and she'd just put a marker through it and say, not on this budget, and would rip it out and throw it away. And she'd go through, and what she does now is she goes through and she comes across these scenes which are either impossible locations or expensive locations, or a dusk shot, which normally you'd have to shoot over 4 or 5 nights to keep the continuity of the light. And she's writing on the top of the page, question mark VP, question mark VP. And then at the end of it, she might have read 6, 7 scripts and gone through and said, yeah, actually, there's 23 pages of dialogue here, which we can bring into a volume, and we can do it very, very cost effectively. So I don't know if that answers the specific questions, but what I would be looking for, things that lend themselves to shooting in a volume, anything where you need to freeze time, i.e. it's a specific time of day, and dawn and dusk comes to mind there. Anything where there's reflective surfaces, where you've got cars or something with a lot of reflections in it, which would be very, very expensive to do in a green screen environment, just because of the amount of post work on it. Being able to work within your talent schedules as well. I can flick from a day shoot to a night shoot literally in 5 minutes at the flick of a switch. So in terms of talent schedule, and also budgeting for talent. If you know that you can get all your scenes done with one artist who's a particularly expensive artist on a film, if you know you can get all your scenes done with them in 1 or 2 days. So yeah, that's a few of them. I mean, there's probably a million I'm forgetting. But certainly I'll go through a script and say locations, I'll save on location costs, I can work with the artist. For example, if you traditionally have a low loader or a process trailer out doing car shots, you know, there's nothing worse than being stuck in the footwell of the car in front with a walkie-talkie trying to talk to an artist, you know. And then somebody says, oh, and it's raining as well. And, you know, you hopefully look at the OP and say, does the rain read on camera? Yeah, of course it reads on camera. But, so, you know, we get into these cars. That's all done away with. I can be at the side of the car talking through the window to the artist. And because they're seeing their environment, because it's not green screen, they're interacting. So, for example, with a 360 plate shoot, they might be driving down the road, and we've all seen those dreadful shots where people are at traffic lights still doing this. You know? And they're physically seeing where they're going and what they're doing. So they arrive at the traffic lights, they react. So the quality, the artist's performance goes through the roof. You know, there's one particular scene with I don't even know if we could talk, Idris Elba, was it? Yeah, well, anyway, there was a scene in the film with a man, I can't give you his name, but it rhymes with Idris Elba. You know, he had to stop at a traffic light, and because he saw what he was doing, he was able to put the arm in, and it just was, and everybody, the artists love it, because they're not being told to imagine there's a monster where that piece of white camera tape is on the LED. So, again, something if you would, where you traditionally got a green screen, I would pull into an LED volume, because also your whole crew engaged then. There's nothing, you know, anybody who's shot on green screen for a week, just engaging with the crew and keeping them active and keeping them enthused and keeping them involved. When you take them into an LED volume, everybody's seeing what's going on and everybody's seeing the process. So that's another valuable occasion.
I suppose it really helps motivation when you know there's no more night shoots and that you can just literally do everything in the day during the normal hours. I see we have a question from the audience.
Yeah, just for all of you really, TFB as well. I noticed there's a lot of LEDs there, LED walls. Are you limited as to where you can put your lights?
Okay, so in terms of using conventional lighting within that environment, LED will never give you a hard light. I can get it so it gives you a harsh light, and the ARRI stage is a really good example because the ceiling will come down, so I can bring the ceiling down and virtually put it up out of frame. I can make it very bright and very harsh. The things you need to be aware of is avoiding getting light onto the LED. So there's a fair few bit of flagging involved of getting light physically onto the LED because it just crushes your blacks out. We have a ring of orbiters. There you go, perfect timing. I'm even in that one as well. We've got a ring of orbiters which we use for hard light, and they're all DMX control back. But because of the nature of the way this wall is designed, this is hung, it's not floor stacked. I can pop panels out and put hard light through them. So if I'm expecting to see a hard backlight on someone, I can pop a panel out and put the light where that panel was.
How long does that take to take a panel out?
Oh, with this wall...
Well, it depends on your studio design, so I mean, it kind of leads in quite nicely.
This is like 10. We had Danny Boyle doing Pistol,
Sounds very quick, pop a camera.
Yeah, 5 minutes. Yeah. So we do little tricks like put digital flags into the displays. So, you know, give me a 20 by 20 black flag over there, and while the guys are walking very slowly to the truck to start getting the gear out, the guys on the playback engine on the Unreal Engine side, they've already put a digital one up there. So you can put any type of light, any color of light, any aperture of light, and you can effectively display it extremely quickly. And you be the sad little faces when they come back out of the truck and into the stage and they've seen you've already done it. It's always quite amusing. But intelligent stage design, I think, has become really critical at this point because we are utilizing a lot of new technology in these spaces. It's really important you think of your spaces and how you deploy these displays and how you make them efficient for your project. In the case of ARRI Stage London, we tried to design it in a way that was flexible enough to shoot almost any type of project. And it is, again, why we've been working with Time+Space. We really have this vision and this dream that we can curate these spaces and build these spaces to enable storytelling with so much more freedom and so much more nuance, that these spaces are really for, you know, our people, the storytellers and the filmmakers.
One thing that seems to be missing from this very expensive-looking equation, I have to say, is that there's no location sound. So that I could be wrong. Perhaps you do location sound playback.
A little bit.
I was asking about location sound playback during recording, etc., or during not recording. You know, whatever, to get the vibe.
Oh, absolutely, and we have two very large tannoy monitor speakers hooked up to the rig, and we did a very cool pop promo recently, but we had to take all the bass out of those speakers, and the reason that was the rigging it was attached to was the same rigging as the tracking system, and if the tracking system moves at all, it causes a whole mess of problems. The tracking system is there to tell the game engine where the real physical camera is within the real space and bind it to the camera in the virtual space, so the two perform time synchronously. We have done it. We have speaker systems, we have music, we have audio tracks playing depending on the project. Sometimes they want it completely silent, but they like a little bit of a bubbly sound coming in, some water or some trees moving. Oh yeah, absolutely. Tea plantation, hint of tea. 4D, absolutely.
On the other interesting point on audio, actually, which is what I thought was the question we were going to ask, was because you're working within a semicircular stage, there is sounds. There's the danger of getting sound slap, and also you can get parabolic reflection of the audio back in. If you make a drum like the Mandalorian drum, they had terrible issues with the audio on that. The way the stage design is going now is people are tending not to make that parabolic shape. They're breaking it up, so it's not a constant angle, so you don't get that parabolic reflection. The other thing I noticed with the ARRI stage when we first put it up was the back wall did go to the floor. And then I suddenly realized, do you know, I never light from that low down, and I'm never using any reflections from that low down. So let's take a meter out.
Okay. What about a kicker, though? Surely you use a kicker sometimes.
Yeah, oh yeah, but then I'm just going to bring that in with traditional lighting. Yeah. You know, I'm just going to, but like from a low perspective, and also it helps the crew because it can be quite a hostile environment working within a volume for long periods of time, particularly if there's a lot of movement on the screen. So the fact that there's a break in it, that you're not enclosed, and there's two, I think there were some images earlier, there's two sidewalls.
So you mentioned some interesting things about your time in Twickenham with these awkward stages you had, which weren't particularly big and they weren't really fit for purpose, modern anymore. Now this technology has come about. How has it affected your planning of these new spaces going forward?
Well, I think they don't need to be very big, is the first thing to say, which is why Twickenham's a great example. So, real estate, if you're looking to find or develop a studio, ultimately you need land, and you put buildings on the land. So I think, again, what's conducive to this opportunity is space that isn't too big. And so with my sort of developer hat on, if I was looking at a 10-acre site, usually that would be gobbled up with sheds, like Pinewood-esque style sheds. In this instance, we can actually create more amenity with other complementary use classes wrapped around the studio, which I think is also vitally important for the modern day producer. It's what I think in the studio I'm doing with Stephen Knight in Birmingham, which you're also involved with, David. You know, we feel very passionately that there should be amenities, which is, you know, hotel accommodation of an adequate quality for both crew and cast. You know, an educational campus, which is critical to driving the new workflows that we're all talking about and training the next generation of filmmakers to actually understand how to deploy this technology and these workflows properly. You know, modern day, probably better quality production offices than maybe what people have traditionally worked in. So we want to create these creative campuses, and I think the virtue of not having to develop more than half of that land with boxes, which, as I say, I think in 5 to 10 years' time, those boxes, they're not going to be redundant, but the demand is going to dwindle, I believe, because more people will be using these. So I think we designed smaller spaces, somewhere between sort of 5 and 7,000 square foot only in each of our sites. And then again, another thing just to mention is we want to integrate those so they can talk to each other. And I think that's another very exciting thing, to sort of have a virtual integration where these sites are physically disconnected but completely essentially the same, is a really exciting thing as well in terms of other workflows that are coming down the track.
So if you build your content, or the guys build content to that pipeline, that means you could be shooting a film in several places in the world, or you could be sending content somewhere else because of talent availability. There was a perfume ad that was done during COVID, and talent wouldn't travel from the States. And on any other schedule, it would have been scrapped. The job would have been scrapped. This was but the reverses were shot in the stage in LA, and everything else was shot in the stage in the UK. So it's a classic example. And those workflows are going to be really important, and particularly for independent filmmakers, because the one great thing about going into a virtual environment as an independent filmmaker, you can look around the world and see where the best tax breaks are. So you can kind of go, this film's set in Hawaii, which is a notoriously expensive place to film, and they don't have great tax breaks. So you can set in Hawaii, but actually, because I'm building it in Unreal, we can shoot this in Budapest, where I'm going to get a 40% tax rebate or whatever. So it's really fascinating for people. You know, people seem to think this is just for tentpole productions. It's not. It's for day-to-day. It's very much for day-to-day production, used skillfully. I mean, independent filmmakers, you know, I mean, they're great at getting good bang for buck. They're fantastic. They're very canny, savvy people. This technology is kind of built for that audience, if you like.
Absolutely, and that's really interesting, because we had a production recently and they needed to do some pickups, but they shot their original footage 3 months earlier, but because we had saved all the data, all the conditions, everything was recorded, it was literally load up the scene file and we were back shooting the pickups, and it made a huge difference. It was a huge sort of light bulb moment for me. It's like, wow, this is a very, very powerful technology.
I promise this is my last question.
No, keep throwing them out there. They're great questions.
So I'm a director. I'm doing micro-budget road movie, journeys from Newcastle to Manchester, like some of which is by moonlight, some of which is by dusk, and some of which is just before. Okay, sort of like journey takes about 2.5 hours in real time. They go through the moors, whatever. So this system, as I see it, to me as a director, is a very attractive looking system. Right? I think, coupled with obviously my astonishing technique as a director, it could actually revolutionise the way that road movies are shot with this system. Right? But if you think of it in terms of cost, which is what we're here to do, okay, I'm thinking one of those LED walls is like $15,000 a day, something like that. How is it saving money? I understand the hotels, transporting the crew, but I'm talking about a micro-budget feature where we have like 3 cast members, we have a crew of like 10 people, maybe maximum. And we could maybe back projects, we could take 8 cameras out and do the journey, shoot the journey with stereoscopic cameras and use that as our back projection, and do some of this in a very old school way. Is this really going to be cheaper for us to do it with a full LED wall VFX stuff?
I don't think necessarily it's cheaper. I think it's not going to cost you more. And I think you're going to get a better quality product, a better quality performance in a controllable environment that's completely agile. And I guess it's where you deploy your spend is what we're saying is the key thing here. So I used to be a producer back in the day, and you know, for me, the big hitting numbers, when I used to look at my budget top sheet was schedule 24, schedule 35, not to sound like a complete geek, but you know, overheads, accommodation, office, facilities, having vehicles parked in your unit base, chugging out electricity and power all day long, which you get charged for. I used to dread getting those bills from the facility service company, you know, at the end of each week. It's all of those costs, which are hundreds of thousands of pounds, if not more, which you will be able to deploy in a more cost-effective way, I think, which makes the thing accessible. That's really, I think, the point we're trying to make, if you agree, guys.
Speed of shooting, actually, if you've got the prep right, I mean, we can cite the example, The Rising for Sky. The Rising came in and they shot 5 locations, 11 setups, day and night, motorbikes, cars, and everybody was home in time for dinner. And that would have, I guesstimated that out as being a 5-day shoot traditionally. So provided you've done your prep and it's test, and that's one thing that I think everybody sitting here would agree with. Get the prep done, get the test done. But once you're physically on the stage shooting, it is incredibly fast. We've not, you know, I mean, I can only speak from my experience. I think some people may have gone on board very early in virtual production. I've certainly met some directors who've had a bad experience and they've kind of walked away from it, but they almost kind of got in too early. You know, they were still there while the banana skins were everywhere, and now hopefully we've kind of picked most of those up.
We've tried our best.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, and the other part is just looking at it from the point of view of being able to use, you know, the different iterations of the technology to kind of pre-plan, and there's a lot more onus on making the decisions up front. And so, you know, that does change the dynamic. It doesn't necessarily box you into, I made these choices up front, so I can avoid those things, but you need to know what kind of latitude you've left yourself in that pre-production planning.
Oh, there was a lady just behind you who had a hand up before. Oh, I think it was you. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry.
No, I just wanted to ask the difference between traditional filmmaking and this versus watching it. Is there any difference? Is there any
For the viewer or...
are you losing any, anything cinematography rapidly from traditional to
When you watch it, no. I mean, currently there are some constraints in terms of the frame rates that we can shoot at. But I'm trying to think if there's anything that I've done on the volume that I've kind of wish I'd done on location. No, I mean, you're aware, it's like if I go onto, I treat the volume like a location, really. I'm a bit of a Luddite. I'm not from a technical background. I go and I look at the screen and then I go and look at the monitor and I treat it as a location. So effectively, you know, I'll like you'd go on any location, you'd look at it and you'd say, okay, how do I beautify this? How do I tell the director's story? How do I make it, light it in a way that's conveying the right mood and the right atmosphere? So not really. I don't have any constraints. I mean, you can't physically shoot right next to the wall because obviously there will be some point where your depth of field will mean that you are physically seeing the pixels or you're physically seeing moire if you're pointing straight at it. But you know, any location I go onto, I've got constraints. So it's just a different way of thinking about cinematography.
When you could then shoot all things that you could do, set in London, with Paris, with this and that, shoot the whole thing.
Yeah.
Here.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
And not have to travel your talent.
Well, again, I think that's no, it's a valid question. Rob made the point earlier. I think people are starting to be aware of this product, and they're starting to write their scripts to be majority housed in the sort of facility like this behind us. And those, you will definitely see not necessarily a saving, I wouldn't say that on the stage, but your budget, if you're working on a £1 million or £1.5 million so-called micro budget, there is definitely a way, we think, of achieving that, because you're not putting your costs, as I just said, your off-screen costs all going onto camera, essentially.
You've got to throw movie magic away. You've got to throw all these, because there's no such thing as pre-production, production, and post-production.
Yeah.
It's all production now. So you can kind of look at it. And it's not a silver bullet. There's going to be loads of productions that are not going to be right for this environment. I mean, somebody came into to the studio and we were wrecking it for doing a shoot, and they had so many location costs already, and they were doing all their wide shots on location, that I said, well, you're actually only coming in here for 3 close-ups, so you probably are better off getting a process trailer and doing it in that instance on location. But yeah, the pre-production, if you think, everybody says the big one is travel, but also set building costs. If you're building within Unreal, if you're building in a virtual environment, your set building costs come down. Sad to say it, the size, but because I've come from a traditional background and some of my best mates are gaffers and sparks, lighting crews definitely reduce in size, significantly, particularly for car shoots. Other savings, a lot of that post money is being transferred and being used up front. So, it's not just the saving of, I don't have to go to a location. That's one of quite a lot less.
Hi, so the ground. I noticed that in some of the shots you have done mandibles that build for the ground. What do you do in instances where the location you're creating is like, let's say it's in the Himalayas or something like that, and you need a wide shot, you need to be able to see some speed to create the sense of the world. How do you deal with that?
Set blending is a really fascinating and non-trivial thing to achieve. You would still work with the traditional art department. I guess the biggest and most exciting challenge, and it's going to be a bit techy, but sort of going to touch everything we've been talking about, is that so far the LED walls that are in production currently, they're only able to produce RGB lights. So dependent on, and you'll see this on people as well as on objects and set pieces, physical set pieces, that the lighting is not really balanced, and psychologically you'll immediately pick up on it. So dependent on the skin tone, if you just walk on a set, and I'm going to come back to actual set design, but when you just walk on a set and you're just going to wrap yourself around with LED, you're going to be either really pinkish or really reddish, and something's just not going to look right. The same goes for anything. So Himalayas, white snow, right? If you were to just light this with the LED panel, which you could, right, because emissive gives off light, you'll get this weird, like, pinky hue on the snow. So there's this really, really fascinating dance with our department putting down set. Someone gonna start lighting, but the wall comes up, and then how to sort of merge and manage this. Now, that again, it's a dance, but the more we've been doing this, and the pandemic had churned a lot of productions out, so the workflow has become slicker and has become a bit more widely understood. Ultimately, there's not really any difference at this point now. It's just you're gonna treat the wall as part of lighting, as part of set. Ideally, that would be up first, because then you know what you're working with, your environment set, right? The only thing that might change is, and iterative, it's great with Unreal, is you get to move around. It's a fully built environment, so if you want that peak a bit to the middle, you can move that peak to the middle, and our department can really respond to this rather quickly. But indeed, the blending will have to happen sort of prior to anyone walking on set, because then everyone would have to start lighting it. And this is where physical lights, so non-LED panel lights, but actual traditional lights are coming really handy, because they're full spectrum. So they produce your white, your amber, etc. that balances out that light that the LED actually just gives off. So at the end of the day, again, you involve every part of production, and you light the exact same way as if you were on a really tricky set at dusk.
But it's more nuanced to, I think, where you're going with the question. So you put up sort of the mountain ranges into the background, you've got your mediums, and you've got your close-ups, and you've basically covered everything from sort of thighs to sort of waist up, and you're happy. You get to the point where you then need to have, let's say, the rock outcrop that you've built traditionally that's then being placed, and the actor standing on that. If you get to the point where you have a wide shot that does not, like, you just can't get the full integration that you need, you have the opportunity in these kinds of tools to basically then say, okay, well, actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to put up a section of green onto that wall behind the actor. And then you can make the proactive choice that coming into this, you know you've got probably about 3 wide shots you want to do. Those wide shots you're going to budget to basically say, okay, I've already built the world, I already have the Himalayas behind, I just need to be able to have the nuance of post-production to be able to integrate that properly. And so you use the green screen functionality, capture those shots, and you can practically have an artist with you on set working in After Effects, Nuke, or other tools, and making sure that you're happy with the way it looks.
Can I ask a follow-up question? If,
Yeah.
Mike, thank you. So let's say the project you're working on, there's no way to work around a large amount of wide shots, very important to the world building. Would this not be ideal for something that requires a lot of scrolling wide shots?
I think getting back to some of the other panelists' points, there's the other factors that come into it. If all those sprawling wide shots are all going to be sunset time, or like other factors that the cost of executing them in some other way, outweighs the gains, you can then go, okay, well, I'm going into this knowing I have some level of post-production, but you can exert the control that gets you what you want the rest of the time.
I think fuel for the wall, really, we haven't discussed that. There's lots of different, what I call fuel for the wall, the different things we can put up on our big telly. And, at its most basic level, it starts as a still that you just download and you put a still up there. And for some purposes and for some things, that might be fine. Then we'll get into or plate work, which for the car work, we'll send a car out with 7 cameras and a camera pointing straight up, and you'll have your 360 plate. So that's live action. Then we get into 2.5D, which is where it gets really interesting, I think, for independent filmmakers, is there are assets out there that are still assets, but what you can then do is you can animate those assets and you can bring those in. I mean, there's a shot that comes up there every once in a while of a guy doing a parkour, jumping off from one roof to the other. Now, that background asset was a still photograph. And what we did when we got it into the studio, we said, hang on, we need to put some animation in this. I'm not believing it. Even though it's a wide shot of Chicago, I'm not believing the shot. So through camera, through the lens, the Unreal guys put do not crash your helicopter lights here on top of the buildings flashing away. We put a little bit of shimmer on the river, and then instantly you've got buy-in. But you haven't got the same level of cost or of time as building a 3D asset from scratch.
Absolutely.
So, and then we've got this other great area, which is photogrammetry, because what we're doing, actually, it's not virtual production, it's a misnomer. We're doing mixed reality. We're generally mixing a foreground with a background. And you have photogrammetry and LiDAR scanning, and that's fantastic if you've got a location that you traditionally wouldn't get access to. I'm thinking like an airport that's not going to let 80 people in, or it's going to be prohibitively expensive, or an art gallery. They're much more amenable to 2 guys going in to LiDAR scan and do photogrammetry. And then you take that asset out, give it to clever people like this, who can kind of then put it together and build you your 3D environment. And what we're finding is the boot's on the other foot now. I've just been involved in a production that's traditional production techniques. When they wrap on every location, they LiDAR scan and photogrammetry every location. They've got no intention of going into virtual, but it's a safety blanket for them. They've got that set locked down. So if there is some problem with death and disgrace insurance with one of your artists, or if there is some problem with and they have to go and shoot, they've got that asset built. And they don't, in this instance, the series is set in the Caribbean, they don't have to go back. So it's kind of a two-way street. And just to close on this, because I know I'm talking too much, but I do love the tech. The other great thing from a director and an art director's point of view is the ability to take a foreground object and scan it and then place it into your background. And you get great buy-in from that. So say, for example, the cinema here, we'd keep the front 3 rows of seats, but then we'd LiDAR scan and do photogrammetry of LiDAR scan the seats, and then those would be replicated in post. And you get great buy-in from an audience when they're seeing a physical prop in the foreground being replicated in the digital world. So that's another fun...
Just to add to that point, I mean, physical set design and production design is so critical to make it a believable image. So you have this beautiful backdrop, but it's really those little nuances in the foreground that really sell it, and that open communication, collaboration between your art direction, your real art direction, and your virtual art department is so critical and key in those early pre-production phases to make sure that the worlds are blended and that what you're looking at does read and is believable. And to your point of, matching colors, light the foreground as you would light any foreground normally, but then you have the ability to bend the image, the virtual image, to match the foreground image. I mean, people will say go one way or the other, but I would say, the thing you can't change in the physical world is the RAL color of that table. You can change the RAL color of the virtual table because it's far simpler and easier to do in that way. And you usually do that in a pre-light day or a tech rehearsal day before the shoot day, and that's also very critical to get everything all perfectly matched. So when you are on your shoot day, you're turning over, and that's where the cost saving really comes from.
And also you get to, sorry, I'm just attaching to that, you also get to previs this inside Unreal Engine, because while you already have the asset, you can place the camera, there's a number of predefined camera presets. You get to dial in your focal length, your focus distance, etc. And you'll be able to visualize what might be a physical and what might actually become the virtual. Even if you just do it with just white cubes, it does not have to be the actual assets if you don't feel comfortable necessarily going down that route. But you do get to actually pre-plan quite closely to the dot what might just be on set. And that is a huge cost saver, because you can just walk in and say, actually, I know what's going to work. I know that I would like my physical cube here, but my virtual cube there. And it's something of a knowledge that you can equip yourself with, quite in advance, and it's all accessible and free.
I have two questions. Then, when you build these sets, these virtual sets, one of the biggest problems with LED has always been that this blue spike in the color spectrum. Is that still a problem when you have these sets?
It's not, oh, sorry.
And the second question is, when there are maybe complicated camera moves, for example, when you want to do a 90-degree tilt, for example, how do you work around those?
The color question, I mean, coming from ARRI, we're pretty focused on color and color representation. We are fetishists of anything when it comes to color. And that's why, when we designed ARRI Stage, we made sure we could implement very clean white light into the space to increase the overall color reproduction that you can achieve in those spaces. And it's not just a spiky blue channel, it's a spiky red channel and a spiky green channel, and there's not much spectral diversity in that output of the screen. And that's why it's really important to supplement your lighting with clean white light. It's not always necessary. For instance, cars, you can get a little bit more away with stuff, unless it's a real color critical representation you're looking for. But for skin tone or fabrics, the video wall can be slightly destructive for color reproduction, which could have an adverse effect in the post. But if you understand this up front in your pre-production, you can do all your lighting design up front and know that you will have a nice clean image, and an image you can still work with in a post world. And that's also very important. Rob mentioned, you've got to be very careful not to contaminate the wall with stray light, because it lifts the black level, and if you've got two different black levels, one in the foreground, one in the background, it could cause you a big problem down the line. Shouldn't be the case if you're working with a good team, people who know what they're doing, but it's those little things that you want to look out for, and it's why we always advise, maybe don't always go with the cheapest crew or the sort of, the most shiny crew, but really, work with experienced professionals in these environments, because it is still a very new technology.
And just to sort of give you an idea about to your question about the RGB, manufacturers are starting to just now look at RGBW video tiles. It's a manufacturing cost issue, and so all these things are going to advance. There's already generations of LED tiles that have anti-reflective coatings, so they have better black points and more resistant to being flashed with light from the wall. So all these things, like the problems you have now won't be the problems you have in 2 years, 5 years, 6 months, depending on when the sort of the stage is set up. To your question about the tilting, if depending on the system, if if it's a stage that is set up with optical tracking cameras, there usually is a gap. So you're going to have to plan that, if I want to go from the ceiling down horizontal, unless you're going to execute that with a very quick sort of whip movement, you are probably going to find yourself in a post-production scenario. So that's why sort of pre-planning and thinking your way through these shots is important. Whip pans, you can do things like actually make it instead of being just the rectangle that follows the field of view of the camera, you can create a strip across the wall. And so you can kind of accommodate more extreme camera motions out of it.
And on that point, we record all the tracking data as well. So what we can do is we can do a simulcam trick where we shoot it. We know there's things in the shot we don't want to see in that tilt, but because we know all the information of where the camera is looking and the focal thing, we can then do a post-process where we'll put that little floating green box as it follows down, and we can do a comp at a later point. Gentleman in the black t-shirt.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that in comparison to green screen, it's much easier for actors to interact with the environment. For let's say younger actors, how do you find, that's experienced actors, how do you find it compared to being on a real set? Do they struggle to adjust, or can they get into it pretty easily?
We've had really great experience with talent. They all seem to really enjoy it. They love being immersed.
Well, they're working shorter days. They tend to be working shorter days. I'm going to cite ARRI, which is a production which we've been, and I urge you all to see it. It's just about to go on the festival circuit. It's an indie film. It was directed by...
Cynically, a rare grand alignment, and it was shot entirely inside a volume in Finland, which
it was a gondola. Basically, the whole movie is set inside a gondola that, without giving too much away, is stuck on the side of a mountain. The cast are all miners. They shot the entire movie in 21 days. The director, or the DOP, didn't want to break the fourth wall. He wanted the entire thing to be inside the gondola. Now, that's a film that would not have happened if this technology wasn't around. The actors, the young actors who are in it, I think they're 14, 15, they loved the environment. The director got amazing performances because they put a physical gondola and changed. And there's scenes in it where there's the Aurora Borealis behind, and they could instantly switch to that. There's scenes where, they're having to light a little fire in there, and and so there's a classic example of an independent production that, 21 6-hour days they shot the entire movie in.
And I don't believe it would have been done in any other way. And this was also done during COVID, so an added level of complexity in a country that only gets 4 hours of daylight in the winter time, with child actors in a glass hanging suspended gondola.
The DOP wanted to shoot it in a cold storage. He wanted to build a pop-up wall and shoot it in a cold storage facility because he wanted the kids to be freezing, and he wanted the breath on the mouth, and he wanted it real ice on the cable car. They couldn't get a storage facility. It was all full of meat at the time. So, but they did manage to keep the studio at 5 degrees because these poor kids were there in parka coats and they were meant to be freezing to death. So how they kept the studio at 5 degrees, I don't know.
And it was like a starting budget of 26 and it went down to 7.
It was when one director was attached, the budget was 28 million, and then that director became unattached, and all of a sudden the budget was 7. So they had to rethink the whole thing. It was a great film. It's I saw it for the first time last weekend. A rare grand alignment, and it's directed by
Cynically.
Spike Lee's brother. Yeah, really good. Great story.
I just have a question about, you mentioned education in your facility that you're building up north. Because I'm an art director working on huge productions, but I also work on smaller productions. And huge productions set up for this kind of work. They go, we're going to do this, and it all works, and it's sort of seamless, and everyone knows what they're doing. But all the smaller productions, and I don't even mean like tiny, indie stuff.
Yeah, education is a huge point for us. You know, ARRI does a huge amount of education. Epic Games does a huge amount on education. And, you know, people like Epic and ARRI, we hope to work with people like peers on education as well. So it's not just coming from technology or manufacturers, but really studio owners. And there's a fantastic sort of relationship as well that's formed with Birmingham City University as well.
Yeah.
So we're trying to get it in as early as we can. There's a real appetite for the next generation university students to really have this as part of their curriculum. It's difficult to implement, but we're all working quite hard to make that happen. And maybe, Piers, you know, education is going to be a big part of Digbeth Lock Studios.
Massively. I think what you've just described is quite normal, actually, and it doesn't actually help our case when we're sitting here saying it's so good. But I think there's certain productions who I guess are kind of, it's a moment in time now, isn't it, where they're transitioning into the process, let's say. And for us, you know, we want to work with the likes of BCU, who Digbeth Lock Studios has a partnership with, and they're going to have a campus on site, and they'll get the physical experience of working on the sets for the studio and the version of this that we're going to have in the Midlands. And I think it's about giving them the toolkit, without sounding cheesy, to understand that it is all about, as we keep saying, preparation. I was going to say pre-production, but preparation. Because if you prepare and you understand the workflows, then that's where the real virtue and value in these facilities will come to you as the producer. And that's the critical bit. I mean, I've heard certain stories where, for example, in my career when I was a producer, I worked with some fantastic first ADs on set, and obviously, you know, their job is to drive the schedule through the day and to get through the pages, and they want to move on to each setup as swiftly and as quickly as possible. And, you know, I have seen, unfortunately, and it's not that person's fault, that you have first ADs in the environment like this behind us who don't understand that actually they should take more time on a setup, because overall, if the preparation's done and they give the set the chance to breathe and the moment to be shot, then that's why you're there. So I do think there's a whole kind of culture, actually, besides education, that we need to sort of start to try and get at a grassroots level into the psyche of filmmakers and film producers at every level, across every department.
But in order to do this right, we need an extended pre-production time. We need to shorten that post planning and really bring it up front to the because the more time you give us with the prep, the results are just so much more, you know.
Well, and just also, you know, to just offer support, we do have an innovation lab in London, just over by the BFI offices off Stephen Street. And so if people have questions about, hey, we're thinking about this, while the community is building up its collective knowledge and things like that, we're around to answer questions as well and just help understand, okay, you want to do a pop-up wall, what's that likely going to take? You know, what's the content requirements? And we can help before the commitment to making that technological choice or that production choice happens. So we're around to, you know, give our best advice as much as possible.
Just to follow up on, so working in art department, the thing that I'm finding, and it's not really a question, it's more sort of, is that onus seems to be on the either on VFX or on the lighting or the DP or department to actually make this work. And then what I'm finding on the big things is like, okay, I can't do that thing, and then it all gets handed over. You sometimes have a VFX art director, but on the smaller things, it's like just the education and the sort of knowledge of it is just not there at all. Like they're not aware that it could even exist. And I think that that's something that needs looking at, especially in working a lot, trying to work with a lot of universities who don't even teach production design. And I think that's a huge issue.
Production design is critical, is really critical to this process with blending foregrounds and backgrounds and thinking in terms of taking it into. And you're right, and I'm a bit contentious here on this one, that virtual production supervisors are currently tending to come from a post background, which for me is a very strange scenario because we're trying to achieve final pixel on set. So we're trying to walk away with as little post-production as possible. So my feeling is that that process should be led by people who come from a production background, be that first AD, be it a cinematographer, not from someone who's coming from a post background. And I was at a conference last weekend, and there were a couple of big name DOPs there, Greg Fraser, who did Mandalorian and The Batman and this, and a couple of other, even Volta. And there is this big issue at the moment about where does the ownership of the image take place? Because if a lot of work is being done in Unreal and the lighting's being done in Unreal, the DOP needs to be in on that process from very early on. Lighting is the domain of the DOP. So if a DOP is presented with something that's been built in Unreal or however it's been built, and he says, well, you know, this is now burnt in and that's where your backlight's coming from and that's your whatever. You know, so it is part of this learning. It's understanding new roles. It's understanding what a virtual art department person is. It's understanding what a virtual gaffer is in relation to, you know, there are new roles and there's a whole new glossary, if you like, and people need to know where they are in that pecking order.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk, guys. Very inspiring. I'm looking to shoot in the volume feature film, and there's a handful of scenes where I'm going to have a little girl, and she's interacting with the screen because it's a metaverse, and there's going to be a character on the LED screen. My question is this something you've come across? Because my concern is, can it be believable showing a young girl in the flesh interacting with something that's on the screen? Is it going to register to an audience that is believable? That's my question.
I think you could do it, and I think there's a number of ways you can do it. I mean, we had one scene we shot where it was actually utilizing motion capture technology as well, where the artist was interacting with a alien character that was being displayed, but the alien character was being driven by a mocap artist who was also in the same studio. So there was this lovely play and reaction between the artist and the mocap actor who was being displayed in real time on the display. So there's some really interesting tricks and ways of doing it. And, you know, like we said, these are modular screens. So I think in 1899 they even did the gag where they had a little black box behind the screen, and they had the person emerging through the screen and out and into the real world. And you know, have the conversation with the team, come talk to us, because there's lots you can do. You know, pulling off gags and stuff is what we do, and I think the independent filmmakers are probably the best at pulling off gags at those micro budgets, and they're completely believable. And in these environments, it's all sleight of hand tricks. It's very traditional in a lot of ways, and it's very theatrical in a lot of ways. It may seem complex, it is complex, but effectively most of the technique we do in these spaces come from a traditional background.
Yeah, and it really depends on the details. There's nuances to this, right? So the whole system chain from when you move the camera or when a motion capture, an actor in a motion capture suit moves, there's a bit of latency. And so you just have to kind of fall into that groove of the time that, you know, the actor or the child actor is basically saying their line, and the time it's going to take for then the person to respond to it. And if they need to be, then you need to kind of have that rehearsal to kind of know, okay, you know, on the third word in a 10-word sentence is when someone's going to start the part. But as Dave said, it's all doable. The technology is all there.
The latency is not that great though at the moment, is it? How many frames?
Well, for camera, it's down to 8. The motion capture would depend on the system.
Yeah.
But it's also like, it depends on the actor anyway, like whether it's a delay due to the motion capture being displayed on the screen. There are actors with different speech patterns as well, so I think it's just getting used to playing with someone on set. It doesn't really have to be considered as someone digital. But on the sort of A/B, if you were to look, you know, if you were looking to shoot this as an A/B discussion, indeed you can have that character motion capture driven on the actual LED volume. And then for the reverse, if you'd like, obviously you have the flexibility of turning ultimately the fully built, I assume, environment around. And then by the nature of like how augmented reality works with via Unreal and game engines in general, is that the AR will always be in the front plate of your camera. So you do get that flexibility of having the slight defocus of the character immediately who's going to be a digital character, I imagine, and then get the actual reaction of your real, physical talent.
The other nice thing you can do from a cinematography point of view in this is play with layers, and because you're not working within green screen, you can introduce atmosphere. So you can introduce smoke, you can introduce atmospherics, which again really help with that blending process.
Work really well in volume. Atmospherics look great.
Yeah.
It's great to be able to do that. There's also certain filtration, there's certain lens filtration that works better than others with the background. One trick of the trade is that whenever I shoot on a volume, the camera is always moving. Even if it's technically locked off, there's always a bit of cha-cha. I'll always have a bit of loose head in it. The minute you've got that believability between the foreground and the background works. And then from an art department perspective, the more layers that you can build in, the better. The more foreground you can, basically the more layers prior to hitting the wall that you
Letting
can
the
have.
lens do what it does that makes it so beautiful. Right?
Yeah.
Can you just clarify what you mean by in volume? You used it a few times. I think I understand.
The volume's a posh way of describing the
It
The
comes
LED.
from the idea of the Mandalorian, which had this cylindrical volume, and so depending on what the ARRI stage has a similar configuration. So it's that idea of the encompassing LED space.
Right.
You'll have some stages that are just basically a curved back wall, and the curvature is there just so that as you pan the camera back and forth, you're not getting shifts in color that come from how you're looking at the little LED tiles that are all part of the wall. But there's a lot of conversation around terminology that you can expect that this is going to evolve a bit and will settle down.
It was a nightmare to start with. I walked onto
yeah.
the set and people were talking about level. And I was going, level? What the level of the sound, the level of whatever. But the level
I've
meant
always
the
liked
background.
level.
And then they kept talking about the camera. And the camera for me has always been this thing with the lens on the front that whirs in my ear. And all of a sudden, the digital camera, the Unreal camera. So yeah, there was lots of discussions about this. Actually, Epic have done a very, very good glossary in the back of, they've got a virtual production field guide, which is quite a tome.
Highly recommend reading it though.
Really, really good.
Really
There's it's evolved into a second generation, and it's people who've had who've had experience. But the glossary on the back is actually really helpful.
Do you have your own on-set virtual VFX department as well? The virtual characters and virtual objects?
We work with a lot of teams. I mean,
Asa Bailey is.
Asa Bailey, yeah, he's a good friend of ours as well. He was a VP Soup on the COP27 gig we shot. I've known Asa.
You can't work with other companies.
Oh, absolutely, and we encourage it, and we have a load of companies who we particularly like. I mean, we work with Framestore a lot, and I name drop them because we've had some really, really good experiences working with them. And we've worked with DDEG on a load of projects. We're about to work with the Mill on another one. We don't want to take over the world with this. The idea and the dream of this collaborative, creative process, which it always has been a collaborative process. No one individual makes a film, but being able to work with all these hugely talented people within the same space in real time at the time of capture is fantastic. And yeah, we rely on numerous content creation partners. We use Brownie Emotion a lot for plates, driving plates for plates. There's another company here we're checking out. And the more people that we trust and believe in our sort of gang and group of practitioners of VP, the better, because all we really want is to see this successfully done, because we've seen it successfully done and we understand what the power of this technology will enable us to do in the future.
I've seen it done badly as well. I mean, I've shot on about 6 different volumes, and to be polite, some are much more user-friendly than others. And you do pay for what you get. Is kind of what I've.
Yeah. But we put a lot of effort into these things, and value for money wise, we spend a huge amount of time and effort with the productions, especially new productions who have never experienced the process before. We will go quite above and beyond in the hand-holding exercise we do with productions in those cases. But the nice thing is when they return for the second time, they're in a groove and they're throwing up flags and they're calling for this and they're doing that, and the experience is, it's a good one. When everyone's smiling and having a good time, you're like, yes, the design decisions were correct because people aren't even thinking about the technology, they're just shooting as they would.
One-day shoots are the toughest because people come in and they feel very constricted by the space. You see DOPs in particular, you see them on day 2 and day 3, and they start getting really creative, and then they start playing, and then they start trying to break it and kind of see how far they can push the boundaries. So, you know, I've sort of helped, well, hopefully I've helped them, but I've been on the shoulders of a lot of DOPs coming into the volume for the first time. And there is that nervousness at first, because as I think we started the conversation with this, is that they say they've been told by so many people what they can't do. But then they come in and they play. Tom Stern, who is Clint Eastwood's DOP, and has been for many years, he came in, Tom's, to be polite, in his early 70s. And he just walked in, and it was great to see him come into the space, and he just said, "Rob, I can use this." And it was just wonderful to see him come and have that conversation. And he came in and he evolved, and he absolutely loved it. Yeah.
There's a question in the back there.
Yeah, sorry, I had to cut a bit, so you might cover this. But if I was a sort of strat cash, lower budget production, would you have, and I didn't have the resources or money perhaps to build digital assets or take the time to do that, would you have sort of like, or are you building a library of pre-existing digital assets that I could potentially use if they were like house interiors or parks?
There's quite a few. So ultimately, the Epic Games store where you would go download Fortnite, etc. from. There's a marketplace on Epic Games of the launcher ultimately that you would be using to also just download Unreal Engine. It's all in the same spot. And anything that, for example, we as Epic do, because we, you know, in order to improve the product, in order to improve and realize what tools are needed and build those tools, we do test them as well. And some of the virtual, in fact, the latest virtual production tools, they have been tested on sets actually, you know, to stand the stress of a production environment. And anything that we do release for free on this marketplace. Say it's an entire city, or there's whole like a cave scene ultimately, and you do get to take those assets and drag them around, and then just having mentioned the two, you can create, say I mentioned a cave environment and a city. If you want, you can mush them together in a new project and have a weirdly built Lord of the Rings city on the rocks, you know. So like these assets are all there for you to actually use. And mess around and then see what you like, what you don't like, and then potentially go and maybe try replicate it. And because you'll be downloading it directly to Unreal Engine, you also have a look at like how it's been built, because all of the tools are exposed to you right then and there. So then you get the idea of like, oh, okay, I see that they use this, they use that. What if I wanted purple? Where do I go change that? So you know, like there's ultimately, it's the technology is at your fingertips as soon as you get the asset.
It's a huge depository of assets, and it's really amazing. We had a shoot, we had 3 weeks to shoot the whole thing end to end. It was very ambitious, and the only way to do it was to go to the marketplace, find existing assets which had been optimized for playback in a virtual in-camera VFX stage, and then he kit bashed it. And when you hear that word kit bash, it means they're taking it and then they're putting their creative on top of it. So they're manipulating and they're changing it, but they didn't have to build it from scratch, which is hugely, like, it saved so much time and actually allowed that really tight turnaround on a very small budget to achieve, hopefully, we'll see it at the end of the month, a brilliant creative pop program.
Well, and I want to sort of call back to something that Rob pointed out. So as King has said, we've got the Epic Marketplace with, you know, the quick sold assets. And these are photorealistic scans of many parts of the world. Plants, trees, rocks, buildings, so you've got all that to kit bash. But what Rob, I think, pointed out that is really important for everybody to digest is also integrating, you know, sort of blends of 3D and images, right? If you've got the perfect sunset, shooting a photograph of that perfect sunset to, you know, to sort of tie it in, being able to have like a mountain range in the background. You don't need to build a mountain range if you can basically almost like matte paint it. So there's blends of techniques that everybody's already been using that will get you to a great result really quickly, or quicker than you would expect, and at a lower cost. I'd also like to point out that you have the opportunity to take the art department CAD files and bring those in, and so you're not starting from scratch. The investment you've made in the art department can carry through into, you know, what you build in terms of digital sets. So there's a lot of different techniques that will help you get there.
Also, you've got to think about whether there's going to be parallax. I mean, basically, if you're in an apartment and the nearest thing out the window is 2 miles down the road, then, you know, you can be looking at using 2D assets.
Sorry, one more about AI. It's a good sort of but basically, I watched the Epic Games launch of the new engine and the way that it's working to sort of make
The procedural, yeah.
Which I assume is using some kind of AI.
Actually, not really. No, it
Is there, but my question is there any sort of plans to integrate AI into either the filming or the creation of worlds or the volume?
So, I mean, we have, parts of the engine that feed into game technology that allow for training, crowds, things like that. So in terms of like the Mid-Journey-esque AI, that's not really a thing that we're into. So what you saw from that display was the procedural content generation that Kinga just called out. And so that is the idea of taking these scanned assets and then using an artist to basically define behaviors to basically say, when I put a tree into the ground, mushrooms, flowers, little plants go everywhere. So instead of having to go, okay, everywhere I put a tree, I've now got to put these other things and smartly say, okay, I will put that in, and also by the slope of the ground that it's an input into, it changes what those things are. So that's more about how do you create a large-scale environment, and how do you give it photorealistic detail and all those nuances that you can define in the art department as a set of rules that facilitate teamwork.
So that's using
They're ultimately, like, Unreal is very good at, we have a blueprint system that is ultimately visual scripting. So it's, if you will, it's defined there. So you would need someone to define those rules. And you then plug in that tree, plug in by like it's that tree, and point to the asset, or it's that, mushroom.
We have time for one last final question, then we're going to wrap it up. Yes? Dorota.
It's a bit of a cheeky one, this one. Say that I create the stock footage, right? I go out and I shoot 8 cameras, do the whole journey, and it looks amazing. And everyone on this panel looks at it and thinks, wow, this is great stuff. We love this. Can I license that IP back to production to save money on the volume?
I suppose if it's in the agreement, the contract between you and the production, yeah. I mean, if you went and spent the money to produce that content, that content.
Is it really worth much? I mean, you've got so much stock already.
We have no stock. We rely on vendors, really.
I mean, there are companies that specialize in that if they meet their requirements, then you could have a pre-existing agreement with them to license your footage to them after the production. We do try and create an ecosystem for creators so that it's something that could conceivably in the future be posted on our marketplace that you could then monetize that way. And then you'd have hundreds of thousands of millions of eyeballs on it, but it depends on how much they need that same piece, and there's a lot of economics to that. But you are now in the generation of filmmaking where these are viable opportunities for you, where your creative output, the pieces that you put into your production, can be remixed by other people, and that has value, and therefore you could probably fund things that way.
And I think that is the end of our panel discussion on virtual production. Thank you so much for being here with us. Do you want to mention the raffle?
Yes, firstly I thought, I know nothing but what I know more now than I do. So I found that exceptionally interesting, and it's actually making me think about certain projects I have in mind. So hopefully it inspires some imagination and some fire within you to find out more. I'm sure these guys, that they'll be outside for a few minutes if you want to ask some other questions. If you want to exchange details and ask them, I'm sure they're more than amenable to that. The other great thing about this particular presentation, thank you very much to ARRI Solutions, is that we issued everyone with a little raffle ticket, and so there are 15 places up for grabs. ARRI will arrange a day and be in touch with you shortly. You will go down to the ARRI stage and actually witness the stage, the been playing in the background behind you, and I think probably learn and play with some of the assets. Yep.
Absolutely, it'll be a nice day for everyone who's lucky enough to be pulled out of the hat, and we'll put on a great show for you, and it will give you an opportunity to really, hopefully, have a look under the hood and experiment a little bit, and have access to some of the most experienced VP operators in the UK, and hopefully go on a bit of a journey together, and one day have one of your productions in the stage as well.
So what I'm going to do, we've randomly selected 15 tickets. So I will just call them out. If you are the lucky holder of a ticket, just go outside to the desk, our desk out there. We'll take all your details and then furnish them over to ARRI. So yellow 15, if you happen to be a ticket holder, you're one. Yellow 10. Yellow 40. Yellow 6.
Bingo. I'm detective. Bingo.
Well, I might have to redo this. Yellow 20. Perhaps people are just keeping very quiet and containing their excitement as they've won. Yellow 41. Yellow 8.
Where are all these people?
Well, they're topical ones.
Bingo?
Blue number 4. Yellow 18. Well done. Yellow 45. Yellow 30. There it is. Yellow 5. There we go. Blue 1. Blue 5.
Yay!
Blue 2. So what we'll do, those who actually are here and have got a ticket, come and see us, and then what we'll do, we'll allocate some others from people who've attended. Yep. Get that number up. Perfect. Thank you so much. I thought it was fascinating.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And see you outside.